the end of Mark chapter 4 and chapter 5. And I have I'm up here because I have some slides. There's a map of the region. All of this is taking place here near the Sea of Galilee. So from one side, they cross over to the other, and then they cross back. So this is where this is all taking place, and I'm going to leave that up there while I'm reading the scripture this morning. So, Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35, through Mark chapter 5, verse 20. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushions. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told in the city and in the county. The people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and the swine reported it. They began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. So they crossed the sea. They crossed the Sea of Galilee to this region over here. This is Gadara. So they were over on this side of the lake, in the region of the Gadarenes, and in the region of the Decapolis. So the Decapolis are 10 Roman cities that were in this region. And when I was in Israel last summer, I was able to tour one of them. And they're big and they're grand, just like you would expect from the Romans to build. So Jesus had crossed over the sea, and on the way there, he stills the storm. And when he gets there, he stills the storm in this man. This is a familiar story. I don't know that any of us, that this was the first time we've ever read it or seen it. We've read it, we've seen it, we've heard it. But this morning I want to insert just a little bit of additional understanding, another layer to put on top of this story so that we can understand the things that were going on at this time in that region. When we read a story, a lot of times, you and I, we don't understand the context in which it's happening, the political context and the social context.
And it's good to have resources that come outside of the text to tell us what's happening. Well, and when I was at school last week, 2 weeks back, someone made a comment that made me go digging. They said that in this region, there was at this time a Roman legion called Ex Fretensis, pardon me, Ex Fretensis, and that their mascot was none other than a pig. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Ex Fretensis. They were a mighty legion. They weren't just somebody's, regional garrison of soldiers. They were a mighty legion of legend. They were formed by Octavius shortly before he became Augustus Caesar. They fought against Mark Antony. They were stationed in Syria and were often summoned for different conflicts. They were taken to Macedonia for a conflict. And they were involved in all of the suppression of revolts in Judea and Samaria and in Syria during about a 150-year period of time. So these are not an afterthought to the people who would have first heard this story. It would have been front and center in their minds. In the same way that if you and I were talking and we said, we went to Kansas City and we saw somebody from the Chiefs walking down the street. And we wrote that in a letter, and 2,000 years from now, somebody read that and they said, oh, Kansas. Well, Kansas has a large Native American population. And so I'm sure that what they're talking about has to do with, no. You and I know that if we saw somebody from the Chiefs, the reason that would be notable is because they just won the Super Bowl. But people 2,000 years from now may not know that. Just like you and I, when we read this text, until I heard that comment when I was in Portland, even though I've studied this text and I've read commentaries on this text, I had never come across that detail of information, that there was a Roman legion that was stationed in the region of the Decapolis and in Syria, whose mascot was a boar, a pig. And that they were, Rich, do you want to go to the coins? They were involved in this little conflict, and they were summoned by a certain Roman governor named Quirinius. Does that name tickle your memory just a little bit? In Matthew's gospel, Joseph and Mary go to be registered in Bethlehem in the first census in which Quirinius was governor in that area. Quirinius summoned Ex Fretensis to put down the rebellion after Herod Archelaus, who was son of Herod the Great. When he was deposed, there was an uprising. And Quirinius summoned Ex Fretensis to come and to put down this uprising in Judea. Their exploits were celebrated in Roman coins. This is a coin, a capta coin. So this is celebrating the capture of Judea and putting them under Roman rule. And on this side over here, there's a woman who is weeping. And over here on this side is a Roman soldier who has his long spear standing in a dominant posture. And the palm tree in the middle is the symbol of Judea, the symbol of Palestine under the Romans. So these were pretty famous guys, is what I'm trying to say. And so when Jesus comes to this region, and he does this thing, he meets a man who is being oppressed by demons. And when they say, "Who's oppressing you?" the man answers, "Legion." And when the legion asks to go into a herd of pigs, numbering about 2,000, and then those pigs run and are destroyed in the sea, this suddenly becomes a completely different story. Not only a story about how a person was delivered from demonic possession, but a story that now gives us a clue as to why people begged Jesus to leave their region. Leave us alone. Don't come here starting trouble. Don't come here starting trouble. Do you want to go to the seal, Rich? This is the official seal for Exfratensis. And you can see the boar at the bottom of the seal. And if you want to go to the next one. And this is a coin celebrating Exfratensis. I know it's not very good quality. But again, with the big boar and the little piglets underneath. You can go back to the map. So Jesus coming and doing this thing felt very political to the people that he was interacting with. A lot of these stories that we read have a similar kind of political understory, story behind the surface that we don't see because they don't include it in the text. Because it would have been so obvious to the people who were first receiving these stories. It would have been obvious that when Jesus said, "What's your name?" When he asks the man about who is oppressing him, he's being oppressed not only by demons, but the whole region is being oppressed by these Roman soldiers. I want to go ahead to the next story, the story about these two women. So let's pick up in Mark chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus again had crossed in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all she had, and she was no better, but rather she grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware of the power that had gone out from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly, and when he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." They laughed at him, and he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk around. She was 12 years of age. And at this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. This story happens, pardon me, when they have crossed back over to the other side of the sea, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But it doesn't tell us exactly where they were. The Sea of Galilee is a pretty big place and has lots of different villages. Jesus has crossed back over, and he's immediately met by this double conundrum. First, this little girl who is sick, and then on his way to heal her, this woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years. This story is another one, and the reason that I put both of these together today and kind of squish them is that this is also a story about something bigger than just 2 healings. There are scholars who, in examining the writings of this time, note that oftentimes a person's physical body is representative of more than just the person in the story, but of their whole community. So just as we saw that this man was oppressed by this legion of demons and how his community was oppressed by this legion of Roman soldiers, in this story, we've gone from a man who is living in the Decapolis, right, a Roman part of the world, where they're under oppression, to back to the other side, back to Jesus' own folks, right, the Jewish community. And we have this double story about women whose bodies are being afflicted. And both of them carry the number 12. Both of them carry the number 12, which is significant in that it points to the broader Jewish community, and in fact, all of God's people, Israel. And so as we see that this woman has been suffering for 12 years, and we see that this little girl has been living for 12 years, we can see that the things that they are suffering from represent more than just their physical bodies, but represent the community of Israel that many were feeling was being drained of its life. It was a time of great oppression, and no matter how many times teachers would rise up and say, "I will bring you freedom," it never happened. And no matter how many times people would rise up and try to overthrow their oppressors, it never happened. Instead, they were taxed within an inch of their life. Instead, they were under oppression and Roman rule. Instead, they were captives, and like that woman sitting beside the palm tree, were broken. They were broken. And so these 2 women, this woman who had suffered the hemorrhage and the 12-year-old girl, we can see that Jesus' healing of them is more than just an offer of hope to these 2 individual people, but an offer of hope to their whole community. When I read stories like this, and when I read scholarly articles on these texts, and when I see that there is a connection between these stories and the community, it reminds me of what we'll read in a few weeks when Jesus stands and gazes out over Jerusalem and says, "If only you knew what would bring you peace." I wonder sometimes if in our far removal from the situation, if it isn't easier to spiritualize every story that we read in the Bible and say that Jesus meant that he wanted to bring them inner peace. What if Jesus really wanted to bring them peace? What if Jesus wants to do more than just give you peace in your heart? What if Jesus wants to transform your situation? What if Jesus wants to heal? Not only your life, not only your inner life, but give life to your body, and beyond that, give life to your relationships. What if God wants to do more than just make you feel good from day to day, but wants to affect actual change in your life? Do we give God room to do that? Do we give God room to make actual change in our lives? To bring actual healing in our communities? To give actual peace? A peace that goes beyond understanding. That Paul says will guard our hearts and our minds, and I believe Jesus wants to guard our lives with his peace. When Jesus heals these women, it's with no strings attached. And I think perhaps sometimes what keeps us from allowing God to do God's work in us, God's healing work in us, is that we're afraid. We're afraid of what God might ask from us in return. Or we're afraid that that healing won't look the way we want it to. And I may just be speaking from myself this morning. Maybe none of you struggle with that. But sometimes I'm afraid to really give God the ability to work in my heart and life, in my relationships and in my body, in my mind, healing wounds of the past. But I believe that God desires to do that. And I believe that God offers us that healing and grace with no strings attached. My hope in saying these words is that you will listen, that you will take them to heart, that you will think that perhaps God has something in store for you beyond just feeling good for today, but something that will change your life forever. Are we willing? Are we willing to trust?